This is Undercurrents from Unheard, a twice-weekly news show covering the news and ideas that matter beneath the surface. If you're enjoying the content, please go ahead and click subscribe. It really means a lot to us. Or if you want to help build the show, you can actually go to undercurrents.tv for the full experience. Your first month will only be $1, and subscribers get access to a huge range of behind-the-scenes content and paywalled bonus episodes too. This is big, and it's only the beginning. We have a big show today. We're going to start in the newsroom with James, as always, discussing some breaking news, which is Kamala Harris' selection of Tim Walz as her vice presidential running mate. After that, we talk about Elon Musk's feud with Keir Starmer, Tucker Carlson's appearance on Red Scare, and James does a really excellent deep dive into the scandal rocking Olympic boxing. I'm going to talk about how Donald Trump is indeed botching his campaign, just not in the way the media wants you to think. I'm so excited for everyone to see my interview also with Tim Miller of the Bulwark and MSNBC, who makes the conservative case for voting for Kamala Harris. Tim and I disagree on a lot, but that's why it's kind of a rare conversation, a rare opportunity for people to sit down and discuss something nobody's talking about, which is, should conservatives vote for Kamala Harris? So stay tuned for all of that ahead. All right, James Billow, Unheard Newsroom editor, juggling actually a lot of breaking stories today out of Washington in particular. What have you got for us, James?
So just moments ago, at the time of recording, Kamala Harris has announced her vice presidential running mate, and that will be Tim Walz, the Minnesota governor. Now, this has led to a pretty divided reaction on both within the left and between the left and right. But let me just give you a quick overview of exactly where Tim Walz stands on a lot of issues. So the idea is that this is a Midwesterner from a pretty blue state now to balance out Harris's California liberal credentials.
A blue state that has a lot of Trump support in some of the rural areas. Northern Minnesota, Donald Trump did a rally in Duluth, northern Minnesota, because some of those formerly, he's Tim Walz, member of the Democratic Farmer Labor Party. It's not the same Democratic Party. It's a weird quirk of Minnesota politics. These are areas that were, the heart of America's Democratic Party, places like Minnesota and Wisconsin. And Donald Trump is really popular in some of them.
Well, this is also part of Walz's appeal too, because he has this sort of moderate facade. And he is a rural lefty, as you mentioned, and he won the 2022 gubernatorial campaign by about 200,000 votes. Most of those votes came from the rural parts of the state. He was also instrumental in organizing the weird attacks that we've seen on J.D. Vance and Trump. But this isn't to cloak his extremely progressive views on a lot of issues. So on the one hand, we have someone who wants to keep gun laws lax. He voted against the bank and auto bailouts in 2008, so that's the sort of populist side to him. But he's also very strong on abortion rights. He declared Minnesota to be a refuge for transgender surgeries. And he wants gender surgery, and gender surgery now is publicly funded. And of course, and this is something the right have picked up on, Minnesota was a real hotspot for BLM activity and rioting in 2020. And it was argued at the time that his permissive leadership basically gave way to a lot of the stuff that happened those few weeks.
It's so interesting. Yes, he was very much on board the sort of BLM train back in the summer of 2020. And, James, I was reading yesterday as the VP race was on in Jacobin, a very interesting Branko Marcetic piece about how Tim Walz was the progressive choice among all of the different candidates. Obviously, young lefties were really against Josh Shapiro, the Pennsylvania governor. Pennsylvania really is the ballgame, electoral college-wise. You win Pennsylvania, your sort of Democratic blue wall is looking very, very strong. And so huge sort of political argument for Josh Shapiro, to the extent that as a vice presidential nominee, he could make a difference in Pennsylvania. Anything in Pennsylvania helps, obviously. But young leftists were really animated against Josh Shapiro because he volunteered for a non-combat role in the IDF after college, or maybe even in the middle of college. And that could have been a sort of big, I don't know, how would you describe this? It could be something that would have given momentum to the left heading into the convention, heading into November, mobilizing against Kamala Harris when she's already swimming upstream against the charge of a coup.
She's clearly selected the left wing of her party over the center. And you're right to pick up on Pennsylvania, which carries those all-important 19 electoral college votes. But already we can see the line of attacks that the right are taking here. They think Kamala has scored a massive own goal here. We've had Jim Garrity of the National Review, Damon Linker, Ben Shapiro, all zoning in on this idea that she's more interested in doubling down on her radical base rather than appealing to those centrists and the moderates and the independents. Now, as you mentioned, the progressives have greeted this decision with much fanfare. The Branko piece was probably the most eminent example of that. And he was describing Walz as the progressives moderates and arguing that that is the obvious VP choice. But it just also goes to show that all those coconut memes, all that online reaction, that excitement with the young left actually might have filtered through all the way down to Harris. And this may have been the choice in reaction to that.
Yeah, that is really interesting. He's apparently an affable guy in person, but I have seen many of these Midwestern progressives who I find to be a fascinating breed. You know, I'm from the Midwest, and there is something right now especially relevant in those pockets of the Midwest where you have these hardcore pro-labor progressives who are now juggling the culture war issues in different ways. And I've seen them come and go. I've seen Randy Bryce, who was supposed to beat Paul Ryan or give Paul Ryan a close race. You know, his star rose and faded because it's a really hard thing to pull off. So if Tim Walz can do it, you know, more power to Kamala Harris. She made a good pick. James, I understand that Elon Musk and Keir Starmer are in something of a feud.
Elon Musk has responded to the unrest in Britain caused by the Southport stabbings, in which 3 girls were stabbed by the son of Rwandan immigrants. Now, he was not an asylum seeker and he was not a Muslim, as much the framing and misinformation surrounding that case has been. But Musk set off this incendiary tweets essentially saying that civil war was coming. Now, in the days after, Starmer's spokesman responded that there was no justification for comments like that. But in the intervening period, Elon Musk has doubled, tripled, and even quadrupled down on those comments, saying, why are you vowing to protect the Muslim communities and not all communities? And this has sparked something of a reaction online. So we had the FT's Edward Luce criticizing Musk, saying he is a menace to democracy. He's using the largest and most influential platform in the democratic world to stoke racial conflict and civil breakdown in his own post and what X promotes. Democracies can no longer ignore this. Now, this tweet got around 27,000 likes at the time of recording. So it's now become a free speech question. And a lot of liberals have joined in on this piling in on Elon Musk, with the likes of Paul Mason, a prominent British Labour figure, suggesting that Musk was trolling the UK government. Now, on the flip side, we had the likes of Ayaan Hirsi Ali and other free speech activists saying that this would be wrong. We don't want to invite censorship. It's a pretty ugly situation that's unfolding at the moment.
Right. It started primarily as a conversation about immigration, and now it's evolved into one on speech, which seems to me like a kind of unforced error on behalf of people like Starmer, who were sort of winning in the media because the media is sort of favorable to that position on migration and sort of the liberal position on migration. But now the overplaying of the hand and saying that this is all the fault of free speech and we must be policing more speech, it added another layer that's not helpful at all to just politically to Starmer's case in this instance, it seems like.
Right, and the direction of travel here is pretty clear. A few days ago, we actually had Keir Starmer calling for facial recognition surveillance of the far-right thugs who were initiating a lot of these riots, and now we're seeing all his ministers backing that up in different forms. So with regards to X specifically, we had Justice Minister Heidi Alexander calling Musk deplorable, his top Interior Minister, Yvette Cooper, saying that they had a litany of complaints over the way the social media giants like X have been policing incitement and disinformation, and are calling for greater scrutiny of exactly how they operate. Lastly, we had Britain's Tech Secretary, Peter Carl, say it was undeniable that social media had provided a platform for the rioters. And so we can really see the machinery of censorship working its way towards Elon Musk's platform now.
James, I hesitate to identify as a fan of any particular show, but if I were to identify as a fan of any particular podcast, it would be Red Scare. Tucker Carlson dropped by, hung out with the girls, or they hung out with him in Maine. Tell us what happened.
So yes, just a quick overview of exactly what Tucker's been up to in the last year, because he is no longer on the screens of Fox. He left that network in April last year, went on to set up the Tucker Carlson network, and his interviews have ranged from anything from the president of Russia, Hungary, Serbia, all the way down to gay crackheads who claim to have sex with Barack Obama. So quite the range there. But he still remains a hugely influential figure on the right. And he featured at this year's Republican National Convention. He was actually seated next to Trump on one night. The level of influence he has cannot be denied. And so when he appears on these various podcasts, it's always worth tuning into what he has to say. So he was on the Red Scare podcast, where he basically sounded incredibly doomerist about the direction of the country. And he did not spare any criticism for Joe Biden. And at the same time, he is clearly quite enamored with other countries, namely Russia.
The main problem, though, isn't either one of those things. It's a leadership class that hates its population. That's the problem I have. I mean, I've spent a lot of time abroad, including in monarchies, that are pretty well run, actually, and pretty responsive in general to the needs of the population, believe it or not. And, well, most of history has been the history of monarchies. And, you know, some of them have been pretty beneficent and pretty popular. And they exist to this day. Putin runs one of them. And he's very popular.
Much of this praise stems from an animosity towards America and its leaders. He's very clear to distinguish between America and the leadership who he believes hates the people. Now, there's just one more clip I want to play for you from this interview, just to show you exactly where the discourse is headed. So he attacked the hyperliberalism of America, which he described as the following.
I say gay race communism is like perhaps the greatest contribution the internet has made to my life in the past 5 years. It's like, what is this that we're watching? For a while, I was like, oh, it's neoliberalism. I'm just trying to find a word.
Yeah.
Can't find one. Can't describe it. And gay race communism is just like the perfect distillation. I'm not even sure what it means, but that's what we're watching.
Gay race communism, it is essentially another word for woke. And the idea here is that it aims to redistribute political power, wealth, resources, recognition to identify groups in line with victimhood. And this is all a state-sponsored program.
If you've been listening to Red Scare from the beginning, I think one of the reasons people love the podcast is that you're sort of evolving in real time. A lot of people, I guess, have evolved ideologically in real time over the course of the last several years, and Tucker has. And so that conversation was sort of valuable. It's one of the things that people miss about Red Scare and about Tucker is that they're openly questioning a lot and going in different directions and are like they're bringing open minds to the table. They're open to like having a changed opinion. And that is one of the reasons I thought the conversation was, I don't know, it was interesting. Like, people should be allowed to have those discussions and talk, and I don't agree with all of it, but, you know, I think Tucker's more interesting than people give him credit for. Anna and Dasha are super interesting people too. So I guess that's the benefit. James, I'm very eager for the deep dive you've prepared for today's show, because I have had a really hard time figuring out what the hell is going on with the boxing controversy at the Olympics.
The reason it is so tricky and complicated to follow is because it doesn't fall neatly into any kind of category. I mean, literally in the case of these two boxers. So just to give a quick overview of where we are, we had two Olympic boxers who had failed eligibility tests. These are chromosomal tests to test the sex of the boxer. And they were not allowed to fight in last year's World Boxing Championships. That was in 2023. Now, the IOC, which is the Olympic Committee, they disregarded these findings, meaning that both Emain Khalif and Lin Yu Ting, they're a different weight category, could both fight. And such has been the success of these two fighters that they are now both guaranteed medals. But what was controversial about this decision is that we had a press conference with the International Boxing Association yesterday, and they explained why Khalif and Yu Ting could not fight in the championships last year.
I try to say that the medical result, blood result, looks and say the laboratories that this boxer is male.
So it was a very testy exchange between journalists and the International Boxing Association. Now, the reason this is particularly controversial is that it came after the IOC defended their decision to allow the boxers to fight. They described the IBA's test as arbitrary. What they're doing here is they're not actually questioning the test result. They're simply deflecting. And again, another layer of controversy is that the IOC tells sports federations, their individual sports, whether it's canoeing, rugby, tennis, anything, they are in charge of managing their own house. However, IBA was stripped of that ruling because they'd failed something to do with governance and finance reforms. So IOC essentially took it over. So the last thing I want to note is that this is not a transgender issue. Based on public information, these two athletes are suffering from a sexual development disorder that affects males called 5ARD or 5ARD. So in practice, that means they are assigned female at birth, but when they hit puberty, they undergo male puberty changes, which means they get all the benefits of testosterone, but still compete in the female category. And that's where the unfairness comes in.
This is so hard to believe that, and I'm not saying it's not true, it's clearly true, but that you have two people with this very rare condition boxing in such a fraught cultural climate, and they both happen to have this really rare condition that makes the discussion way more nuanced. I don't blame a lot of people in the kind of turf world or on the right for having a hair trigger and saying this is absurd. We're watching women get their face beat by men, because that's something that has been defended in mainstream corridors for years now. But it's not what happened here, based on what you're saying, James. They actually both have this very rare condition.
Exactly. And these categories exist for a reason. And unfortunately for these two fighters, they did fail the chromosomal test. They have XY chromosomes, which makes them male sex. That automatically should disqualify you from competing in a female category. So the Olympic fighting is continuing. Khalif has her final fight today. Whether she will get a gold or silver is almost beside the point. And Yu Ting is fighting tomorrow. So we'll keep a close eye on those developments.
A case study in why the exceptions prove the rule. They don't prove that the rule must be changed. This is clearly an illustration of how much more powerful you are if you're, in this exceptional space, quite literally this exceptional rare space. But that doesn't mean that you change the entire sport to accommodate people in those positions, because we see exactly what happens. So it's just a ridiculous, we're in such a ridiculous place as a society, as the West, that we can't sort of clearly delineate right and wrong in situations like these. But James, Billow, thank you for diving deep on that one. I really have had a hard time piecing it together. It's just been insane. So much appreciated. Donald Trump is botching his campaign, just not in the way most political professionals are claiming. And the reason is actually much more interesting than they know. As in 2020, Trump is less focused on the substance of his class critique than he was in 2016. But the political experts, per usual, are focused elsewhere. To hear them tell it, Trump's extremely Trump-like performance at last week's National Association of Black Journalists Summit was somehow evidence he'd lost a step. Of course, literally everything that happened on that stage could have been ripped straight out of his 2015-2016 primary campaign, when Trump somehow managed to win the Electoral College despite being a reality TV host up against a former Secretary of State. And let's ask ourselves again, why was that? A lot of reasons, of course, just like any campaign, but winning Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania mattered as much as anything. And Donald Trump won that so-called, quote, blue wall because of his appeal to the white working class, balanced with Clinton's lack of appeal to a lot of people. And of course, there were high levels of support for Trump in the suburbs relative to 2020. Biden had fewer elite vulnerabilities than Hillary Clinton did. He also had more appeal with black voters, and he had a version of Trump who was distracted, although perhaps reasonably so in some cases, by issues that aren't kitchen table matters for his Rust Belt voters. Our friends Glenn Greenwald and Lee Fong recently noticed this as well. Glenn, on his show, System Update, noted that Trump's genius in 2016 involved throwing out the partisan binary in favor of an anti-establishment versus pro-establishment binary. Lee made a pretty persuasive argument that personnel changes could be a major factor. Let's listen to that.
2024 Trump campaign is sounding a little bit like the 2012 Mitt Romney campaign, where instead of talking about the job losses and the deference to big banks and big business interests from the Obama administration's first 4 years, the Romney campaign was only talking about this kind of typical, this is Obama's a far left progressive. He's an extremist leftist. Why isn't he engaging in more wars? This kind of neoconservative critique.
Matthew Stoller also sees Bannon's current imprisonment and lack of influence over the Trump campaign as a major factor. Writing on Trump back in June for his newsletter Big, one of my favorites, Stoller described the results of an experiment he conducted. Quote, I decided to listen to 3 recent speeches and compare them to what Trump said in 2016 and what he did on antitrust and trade while in office, Stoller wrote. What I found was surprising. In 2016, Trump feuded incessantly with corporate America, telling a story about big business as part of the corrupt establishment trying to outsource jobs and replace American workers with cheap labor. His post-presidential years have seen a different figure. He just doesn't talk about corporate America very much anymore. Something has changed, and I'm, Stoller said, going to try and identify that change and understand its significance. So what about now? In 2024, Stoller wrote, Trump took a pro-corporate turn. For instance, says Stoller, he asked his supporters to stop boycotting Brazilian conglomerate-owned Budweiser after the beer giant engaged in progressive-friendly marketing tactics. This shift was not a one-off. In office, he had been fiercely anti-China and even issued an executive order banning TikTok. But earlier this year, after meeting with libertarian, quote, never Trump billionaire Jeff Yass, part owner of TikTok, Trump reversed his position. In office, Trump personally hated crypto, preferring the dollar, but after meeting with crypto executives a month ago, Trump has pledged he'll support the industry. Now, that was long, but it was worth reading in full because Stoller really did go deep in comparing old Trump speeches with new ones. And after watching recent speeches, Stoller concluded what's fascinating is that Trump doesn't criticize big business and doesn't talk much about jobs going to China and Mexico, though he does talk about tariffs. Instead, Trump has a couple of new themes. First, he argues that the war in Ukraine wouldn't have happened if he had been in office, and more broadly, global leaders like Xi Jinping respected him in a way they don't respect Biden. Second, he complains nonstop about electric cars. Third, he is now making arguments about gender questions like trans people playing in sports. Finally, he often talks about drilling for more fossil fuels, tax cuts, and deregulation. In other words, Trump sounds like he is the coalition leader of the Republican establishment. So this compare and contrast exercise from Stoller leaves us with a lot to distill. I'd say Trump does still couch a lot of these arguments in populist terms. For example, his decision to flip on TikTok. And there's a legitimate argument to be made that banning TikTok would, for example, boost the political establishment. On Budweiser, even Shane Gillis and Peyton Manning are comfortable boosting the brand these days. There are also important pro-crypto arguments from anti-establishment types who disagree with Matt and probably me on the issue too, and we hear those from Trump. But I think what's critical about Matt's exercise in this compare and contrast, early Trump versus current Trump, is the proportionality. Trump really needs a coherent, dominating, anti-elite message on foreign policy, big business, and culture. Fair trade, fair immigration, fair wages. That's what builds trust and confidence in the Rust Belt, and it's what balances interest in Trump versus interest in Kamala Harris in the suburbs. It could even actually eat away at Democrats' margins with Black and Hispanic voters, which were consequential to Biden's 2020 win and Hillary Clinton's 2016 loss. Trump doesn't have to be, quote, disciplined in the sense a lot of talking heads think, and of course the consultants who send source quotes anonymously to those talking heads. He can call Kamala Harris crazy as much as he wants. He can insult journalists all day and post weird stuff on Truth Social all night and still win. And he can do all of that because people are legitimately very fed up with the political establishment in America, and they are so fed up that they're willing to vote for a guy many of them find kooky because he's at least pledged to, quote, drain the swamp. I don't know how many times people have to say that from 2016 until now for it to actually sink in with the political establishment. But as far as Trump's appeal with that absolutely key demographic of his voters that allowed him to win the Electoral College in 2016, he needs them to believe that he's going to drain the swamp. And this campaign isn't inspiring that confidence like it did 8 years ago. I'm so excited to be joined today by Tim Miller. He's the host of the Bulwark podcast. He is an MSNBC analyst. He's also the author of, I think, one of the best books in terms of giving people a glimpse into how American politics actually work. It's called Why We Did It. Tim, thanks for joining the show.
What's up, Emily? High praise. Appreciate being on with you.
Yeah, for sure. It's been a long time, and I'm sure we both have friends who would hate that we're talking to each other right now. Tim.
For sure. For sure. I'm going to be hearing about it.
Yes.
I'm going to forward the hate mail to you.
Likewise, I'll do the same. But in all seriousness, I want to talk about kind of the conservative case for voting for Kamala Harris, because let me tell you what I hear in my bubble. Sort of the bubble of conservatives in DC, people that I talk to. It's unthinkable that you would have somebody who self-identifies as a Republican or as a conservative, or maybe did self-identify in those ways until 2016 and has no kind of political home right now and wants to vote for Kamala Harris. But I think there are enough voters in this country, in the suburbs of Pennsylvania or Wisconsin, who find themselves in those shoes. So first of all, Tim, does that describe you? Do you see yourself as like a Republican or a conservative for Kamala Harris, or are you so politically homeless you're just a politically homeless person for Kamala Harris?
Yeah, I think I'm probably a politically homeless person for Kamala. And I definitely think it's even thinkable for conservatives to vote for Kamala. I want to make that case here. So let me just level set and cover me first. I was always a moderate Republican. I'm more classically liberal than I was ever really conservative in a meaningful way. And so, the jump from me maybe wasn't as far as it might be for the jump from some others. I always joked to my friend and former Bulwark colleague Amanda Carpenter was Ted Cruz's communications director. And we were always on the opposite side of Republican primaries. I was for the squish, she was for the Tea Party person, right? But we both ended up anti-Trump. And so, the way I view this may be different from the way that some conservatives view this. But I think the way in which it's similar is it's a risk assessment about what is best for the country, what is best for the future of the Republican Party. And to me, ridding us of Donald Trump is the answer on both counts, and Kamala Harris is the vehicle to do it. So I'm happy to kind of walk through the details of that, but that's how I'd sum it up.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and let's start there, in fact, because I would argue that Kamala Harris defeating Donald Trump in this cycle does not get rid of Donald Trump, let alone sort of get rid of Trumpism. So if that's part of a person's risk calculus, let's say in the suburbs of Philadelphia, how would you respond?
Well, sure. Like Donald Trump might be immortal after what happened in Butler. So who knows? And I don't see him going down to Mar-a-Lago to paint like George W. Bush and going away. So unfortunately, we're stuck with him. But I think that his power and his control can be diminished. There have been plenty of opportunities to diminish it in the past that I think were missed. Look, I want to take us back to that period between January 6th and when he was impeached and convicted. During that time, as a vocal never-Trumper, I was arguing that the Republicans in the Senate should convict Donald Trump. And I thought that was the correct thing to do morally on the law, but I also thought it was the correct thing to do for the Republican Party. A lot of people said to me, "Oh, Tim, you left the party, you have TDS, why should we listen to you?" This is concern trolling. It wasn't concern trolling. I think if we go back in time, had the Republican Senate convicted him, sure, there would have been infighting within the Republican Party for a while. The midterms wouldn't have been that great, probably. The midterms weren't that good anyway. But then you would have gotten to 2024. Donald Trump would have been constitutionally barred from running. Ron DeSantis, or who knows, probably not Nikki Haley, really, but some other more conservative person, maybe Greg Abbott, who knows what the field looks like, would have been the nominee for the party. I just think any clear-minded conservative who, and I say conservative in the old uses of the term, not in the, we love tariffs usage of the term, but if you're like a traditional conservative, I don't see how you could not look at the situation that the party is in right now and think, man, we would be stronger right now in the fight against Biden-Harris if one of the conservative governors, Republican governors, was the nominee. The party would be more sustainable in the long term. To me, that was an opportunity that was missed. And it was missed because a lot of people that wanted that future thought that Donald Trump was dead. And he wasn't, and so he reemerged, and we all saw it happen in the primary. And so here we are with a guy that has now, been indicted 4 times, impeached twice, incited a riot at the Capitol as the party's nominee. And I just think anybody that's not a Donald Trump cultist cannot look at that and think that the conservative movement would be better off if they turn the page.
Well, I'm fascinated by this question of a risk assessment, because I don't mean this in a pejorative sense, because I think this is actually kind of common to how a lot of people looked at the 2016 and 2020 elections. The sort of Flight 93 construction that Michael Anton famously developed, which is anything basically to stop what the other nominee, and he was talking about Hillary Clinton at the time, but what the other nominee was going to bring about. Doesn't matter if you like Donald Trump as the vehicle. The plane is going down, basically. And I see, I guess, part of that in reasons almost everybody is giving for voting for either Trump or Harris this time around. Maybe not going full Anton, but maybe going 3/4 Anton. Yeah. And I guess
I'm a half an Anton.
You're a half Anton. Okay.
Yeah,
Respectable. But in that sense, Kamala Harris, where does she specifically factor into this? Because there are a lot of assessments of her platform and where she's kind of gone politically. My friends on the far left will say Kamala Harris is just ultimately a centrist. My friends on the right will say Kamala Harris is as far left as anyone ever could be. How do you see Kamala Harris fitting into that?
I think Kamala Harris is a political chameleon. I just think that she's, gone to where the center of gravity is within the Democratic Party her whole career. I think she'll continue to. That might seem like a criticism. I don't really mean it as such. I mean, I guess ideally that you would want your politicians to have a pure ideological perspective and judge them based on that. But we're not in an ideal situation with the various campaigns. I look at Kamala and I think, look, the Republicans, barring something even more insane than what's happened in the last month, happening over the next 3 months, the Republicans are going to have a majority in the Senate. So I don't understand the Flight 93 perspective looking at a Harris presidency. She's going to have a team of mainstream Democrats around her. She's going to have a Republican Senate. At best, she's going to have a Democratic House majority with like 2 people, a 2, 3, 4, 5 majority. Socialism is not coming in divided government with a 6-3 Republican Supreme Court. I can't even fathom what the worst case outcome that these conservatives are pointing to with Kamala as president, given what would the Supreme Court and what the Senate would look like. On the other hand, if Trump wins, Trump conceivably could have united government. We already said he'd have the Senate. I think he'd probably bring the House with him, and he would have a 6-3 Supreme Court majority. And then you would have a 78-year-old man who already, maybe he did it ham-handedly, but he already tried to stay in power against the will of the people once. Looking at him being 82 in 4 years, being 82 with the potential for jail on the other side if he gets out of the presidency, having already incited a riot at the Capitol in an attempt to stay into power. Like, is that a gamble that's worth taking? I mean, like, this feels like national suicide voting for that. A risk of national suicide. Not certain. This is why I'm half an Anton. Not certain. Maybe Donald Trump will get in there and decide that he just wants to golf and he wants, the Supreme Court to make him immune, and J.D. Vance will get to run the government. I'll have my own problems with that, but maybe that'll happen. I don't know. But there's at least some percentage chance that he does not want to give up power, that he tries to do extrajudicial means to target his foes or to stay in power. Like, why? When his faculties are even more diminished, he'll be older then than Joe Biden was during that debate. Why take that risk when, to me, like, the other side of the worst case scenario is what? What's the worst case scenario? Kamala successfully raises taxes on corporations. I guess she doesn't secure the border enough. I guess maybe some nativists would say that's the big risk. To me, the risk calculation isn't even close when you look at the two options.
And we could debate all day about the specifics of what could happen under Kamala Harris, but this hypothetical might even be more clarifying than that, which is if Bernie Sanders had hypothetically won a 2024 primary nomination, would you vote for Bernie Sanders over Donald Trump? Would you not vote? How would you approach that?
In this same environment, I would have voted for Bernie. And again, this hypothetical could have a lot of different, I could imagine a situation where I would have sat out a Bernie election, right? Where when Barack Obama was in office, like, the Democrats had 58 senators, right? You know what I mean? Like, if you had a certain divided government, if Donald Trump hadn't already tried a coup, but in this situation, again, I think that the hypothetical remains the same. I have a ton of disagreements with Bernie. I think that there would be some policies, particularly on size and scope and role of government, that I would disagree with him on. But with him in the presidency, if he, especially with the new Chevron ruling in the Supreme Court, if he overstepped on what government could do, the Roberts Court would overturn it. Particularly if he did so in any ways that are outside the scope of, what the law allows. So, what is the scary part there? I just, to me, it would be a normal divided government where I would have disagreements with the opposition party. I think that's fine. That's healthy in a democracy. Going to a place where democracy is trying to be undermined, where someone wants to flout the rule of law, and they'll have a team of people around them who support that. Like, to me, that is just a totally unacceptable risk.
And that's helpful because it gets into the risk calculus question again. And one other thing I wanted to ask you on that note is when we think back to 2015, 2016, political prognostications, you wrote a lot about this in your book, sort of what was unfolding over the course of those years and what happened even personally, politically, after all of that happened. This is a huge question, but how did that change the way that you saw the country? Because there's conventional wisdom, again, in my bubble, that the 2012 Republican autopsy, which is infamous in conservative circles because it said the party needed to moderate on social issues, immigration, all of that, was a mistake. Donald Trump proved that famous document was a mistake, that the Republicans could be as conservative as they wanted to, not water it down, not do the pale pastels, be bold colors, the parlance of Ronald Reagan. And I don't know, because what you're saying is interesting. You're saying, what if the party was in a much better position right now, had never had Donald Trump, or Donald Trump had been impeached after January 6th, and there was a standard bearer that was more moderate, I guess. So is the country actually ready for a more moderate Republican Party, not relative to Donald Trump, but let's say relative to like Ron DeSantis? Is that what you think?
Well, I guess there are two parts to that hypothetical. So the first one, I've got to defend the honor of the autopsy a little bit, which I worked on.
I didn't know that I kind of guessed that you might have had something to do with it, actually, but I didn't know that you actually did work.
I worked on it. Marco Rubio was basically the autopsy candidate. I worked for Joe. But Marco Rubio basically ran on everything that was in the autopsy in 2016. He's changed in the intervening times. Are we sure Marco Rubio wouldn't have beat Hillary had he won that primary? I think
he was winning with young voters, juxtaposed with Hillary.
I think he would have. Maybe he wouldn't have. I don't know. We'll never know. Maybe something about the way that Trump turned out white working class in the upper Midwest. Maybe they wouldn't have activated for Marco. Maybe he would have done just no differently in the Sun Belt. We'll never know. But I think that given the weakness of Hillary as a candidate, I think Marco probably would have won that. And I think that clearly we would be in a better place now if it had come out like that. But the other option during the autopsy time, and where I am self-critical, is I think that probably the more honest thing to do would have been to have a reflection of how to pivot the party in a way that was more responsive to what the party members, the voters, wanted. And so what we offered was, okay, we can win if we moderate on social issues and appeal more towards a diverse, more diverse voters, do better in the suburbs with women, right? That's what we offered. When maybe instead the right thing to do was say, hey, we have turned off working class voters through irresponsible wars and through, too pro-corporate business policies. And maybe instead of changing our views on immigration and gays, the party should change the way it views foreign policy and economic issues. And I think that would have been received much better among Republican voters. And maybe a standard bearer who was much more responsible, that had that kind of worldview. I always think like an American Boris Johnson type, though he has some irresponsible traits, but certainly more responsible than Trump. If that person could have emerged and led a Republican Party to a place that I probably still wouldn't like, right, as a centrist neoliberal squish, but I think that would have been healthier. And maybe wouldn't have included some of the conspiracy mongering and craziness and lying and bigotry that you see out of Trump.
Although, is there a good argument that's sort of swallowing both? I mean, you'll probably dispute this. You'll probably argue against both sides, but it does seem to me like the conspiracy mongering, all of that is kind of a product of the times of social media, mingling with these other sociological factors. I wonder if there's any way to escape it, even if there is a sort of autopsy standard bearer that emerges as the Republican champion.
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know. I think history is contingent, and I think that we would be in a would conspiracy mongering go away if somebody I don't know, pre 2017 JD Vance had led the GOP. No, conspiracy mongering wouldn't go away, but you'd at least have a responsible person at the top of the ticket that would, argue for legitimate policy, legitimate change in the policy outcome. I think it would matter. The line I always use is if Ted Cruz had won in 2016 and become president and then lost to Joe Biden, There'd be a lot of things with the Ted Cruz administration I wouldn't have liked. There'd be some that I would have liked. One thing I know for sure is that there would not have been a mob of people carrying Ted Cruz flags, storming the Capitol and beating up police. I know it's one counterfactual I can state for sure. That is a unique thing to Donald Trump. These other people do not have that kind of cult of personality. They do not have that kind of sociopathy to keep up a lie over the course of a half decade that's obviously false about election fraud, and then to force other people to comply with the lie. It takes a very unique demagogue to do that. I think Donald Trump's a very unique demagogue, and I'm not saying that it's all lollipops and ice cream on the other side if we got rid of Donald Trump, but I think that the country would be much better off. I think the conservative movement would be much better off if he just suffered a clear defeat this time.
He would probably love that unique demagogue formulation, by the way. He would probably post it to Truth Social.
Maybe he might.
Like Tim Miller. Thank you, Tim Miller, for the compliment. I am a unique demagogue. Okay, so before I let you go, though, in the spirit of challenging my own conventional wisdom, the Amanda Carpenter-Tim Miller friendship going from 2016 to now is such an interesting one because here in D.C., there aren't a lot of those friendships anymore, meaning the people who were for Cruz have either hung out with the Tim Millers or they've hung out with the Emily Jashinskys. We're sort of like the way the Republicans who were for Jeb but also for Cruz used to mingle in the same spaces. Like, that is done. That is over with. So what do you think people kind of in my bubble, hopefully not me particularly because I try to get out of it, but what do you think the kind of populist right is missing? Because maybe we've seen some of that with J.D. Vance hitting the big stage and people realizing that the childless cat lady jokes aren't going to be popular on a bigger stage. So what do you think the populist right is missing?
Boy, a lot.
Sure, that's a good.
I think, come on, guys. Well, the sexist stuff is a good place to start. I don't think that that's going to land with people. I think that maybe more women should be invited into those circles besides you, Emily. I'm sure you're doing your best, but I think it's a little dude heavy of a bubble right now. Look, I think that what they're missing is this. We all have this flaw, and I think that it's particularly acute in the populist right. There's the good George W. Bush line about how we judge other people by their worst examples and ourselves by our best intentions. I think that the populist right has rationalized advancing conspiracy theories and lies that they know are false because they look at the worst examples of the left and they say this happens over there too. Like, this is
Russia collusion.
We have to win war. Yeah. And so we can do it. And I think that's a misunderstanding of what's happening on the left. I think that the left, the Democratic Party right now, is much more, has certainly bad actors, certainly there are lies that get advanced, but it's a vibrant, diverse party where there are diverging views, where they work things out. And for example, when you have a weekend at Bernie's president as a leader, there are people within the party that are willing to say, guys, we have a weekend at Bernie's president. We should go a different direction. Like, that's the sign of health within an organization. And the fact that on the populist right, like, you can't say that. Like, if there's certain things that are verboten, such as Joe Biden won the 2020 election, full stop. Like, not, but there was also COVID, and Joe Biden won, full stop. Donald Trump lost, right? Donald Trump, has committed crimes, has committed sexual assault, admitted to sexual assault. Again, maybe you can say, I like Donald Trump still. I still judge that he's better than Kamala because whatever. But like, Donald Trump did these things, and if you cannot criticize the leader clearly, then that is corrupting. And that prevents introspection, it prevents challenging your beliefs. And I think that in some ways there's a weird connection between that and the childless cat lady thing, right? Because it's like, I think that they're in a bubble where it's like, we can say whatever we want and we can trigger the libs and we can just focus on this, we can lie and there's no consequences, there's no ramifications because Trump is the best Trump. And I think that it's something that a lot of these people are going to come to regret, because I just don't think there's any healthy organization that is premised on having to advance lies in order to be a member in good standing.
And yeah, you know this as well as I do. The reason for that is that there are these litmus tests now that it's sort of like the 2020 election is a good example. It's sort of the need to say you're in this group, you're out of this group. And I don't mean that actually in an entirely bad way, because, frankly, a lot of people on the right want to make sure that they're not, boosting a future Tim Miller. You know what I mean, right? Like it's the litmus test to say, like, are you with us or are you against us? And it has some really dangerous, I think, downstream consequences.
Yeah, I agree with that. Look, I get it. And in some ways, it's an overreaction to some of what we talked about with the autopsy, right? Like, there were legitimate criticisms about me, right? And about my people. I'm a stand-in for people, right? That it was like Republican voters are being represented by people that did not share their values on LGBT issues and immigration, in particular, maybe foreign policy. Like those three things come to mind, maybe some other things. And we were, and we knew that. And so we were sort of hiding the ball in certain ways, and as I write about in the book, throwing them red meat to try to appeal to them, and that was corrupting on our end. And so I get that, right? Like, wanting to have leadership that reflects the base's views is fine. Like, that's healthy. That's good. When it goes into, okay, though, now we need to have shit tests, where it's a gang initiation, where you have to lie, you have to tell an absurd lie to demonstrate that you're with us. I think the pendulum has swung too far.
Yes, that's super interesting perspective, Tim. And one of the reasons I want to talk to you is I think people on the populist right don't understand that there are self-identifying kind of right-of-center people out there, again, in the suburbs, in some of these very consequential electoral college swing states, who will be looking at Donald Trump and Kamala Harris a lot differently than the people who, again, like me, who sort of see the political benefits of a J.D. Vance. It all has to be balanced, because there are a whole lot of people who still really don't like Donald Trump.
Yep, no doubt. They're all my friends. I grew up in the Denver burbs, Emily. It's like all I always think about my buddies' wives from high school. It's
yes.
like any of my buddies, like all of that, they're middle aged, they have kids, they grew up in conservative families, and they're like, I hate this guy, and they maybe can still consider themselves center right, but they look at what him and JD are, and you add the childless cat lady onto the Trump thing, and they're just like, sorry guys, I might disagree with Kamala on tax rates, but I'm not. You're not selling me on this, and I think that that could be a key demo, and it was key demo, frankly, in 2020, if you actually believe the election results and what happened in Georgia. Just look at it. Brian Kemp won, and Raphael Warnock won. Those people exist. They are, maybe not completely aligned with me on everything, but like directionally on sort of the arguments that I'm putting out here, I think.
Yeah, no, I'm sure Kelly Loeffler would agree with you on that one. Tim Miller, super helpful conversation. Thank you for being willing to come on. Tim hosts the Bulwark podcast. He's an MSNBC analyst, and his book, again, which we've referenced a couple times, is called Why We Did It. Highly recommend it. Appreciate it, Tim.
Thanks, girl. We'll talk to you soon.
Sounds good. Well, thanks for tuning in to today's edition of Undercurrents. We'll, of course, be back here on Thursday. If you want to support the show, make sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel, Undercurrents. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Leave us a review, likes, comments. Those things help so much. We're so grateful to everybody who has done that so far. And if you want to get the full experience, undercurrents.tv is the place to go. There's so much premium content over there. More videos, more episodes. It's awesome. You get the whole thing right there on undercurrents.tv. We'll see you back here on Thursday.